Welcome, friends, to Family Science Home Edition in the Kitchen with Melissa. Family Science had been a monthly event for kids and adults to try some fun science experiments. Science wasn't always the main focus. It was more an opportunity for kids and their grown-ups to work together and try some science-y things, do some principles of what happens when you mix baking soda and vinegar together. Basically, come to the library. Cat is clawing my leg right now. Come to the library, try something new, make a mess, and then I would clean up afterwards. So while the library's closed, I'm going to be doing some science experiments from home. I'll bring the science to you, demo some science-y principles, make a mess, and also clean it up myself. I also wanted to give a kind of a heads up that this is intended as a hands-on activity for adults and kids to enjoy together. So since we're focusing on kitchen science right now, I would encourage as much adult participation as you deem appropriate, because there may be some chopping, maybe stirring things on a hot stove or putting things into a hot oven, which require adult supervision. I would suggest that kids help measure, mix, and stir and observe while adults use knives and attend to pots on burners or pans in the oven. So as a personal note, I kind of view cooking and baking as an experiment because nothing turns out exactly the same each time. Sometimes I have to substitute ingredients. Sometimes I forget altogether to put ingredients in. So all that being said, be safe in the kitchen and experiment with recipes. So this is a follow-up from last time in which I made vanilla pudding from a cookbook called The Young Chef, which is available on hoopladigital.com. There is some difference in the ingredient list for chocolate pudding than vanilla in that it does not require eggs whatsoever. So it has similar ingredients again: the milk, the sugar, salt, cornstarch, chocolate, butter, and also vanilla. So it would be an interesting thing to think about. How is pudding with eggs different than pudding without eggs? Are the eggs really necessary? And if they're not, what qualities does chocolate have that kind of make up for the lack of eggs? I don't know the answer to those questions, but can pudding be pudding with eggs or without eggs or both? So today I am using not a kid's cookbook, a grown-up cookbook by Mark Bittman called How to Bake Everything. It too is available on hoopladigital.com, accessible with your library card. I own the print edition, so I'm going to rely on that rather than the laptop this time. So, Mark Bittman says, this chocolate pudding recipe is as easy as simplest vanilla pudding, but with a deep chocolate flavor. Replace the dark chocolate with any kind you like here, as long as it's good quality. I would add, replace it with any kind of chocolate you like. If you prefer milk chocolate to dark chocolate, use that. I don't think it's important that it has to be good quality per se. It just has to be something that you like. I use chocolate chips because that's what I have in the house. They are semi-sweet, so they have 60% cacao. Cacao is the plant that makes chocolate, I think. Anyway, the recipe calls for dark chocolate, baking dark chocolate or dark chocolate in a bar, which I don't have. So I substituted chocolate chips. Okay, so it starts with similar steps where you combine milk, sugar, and salt in a saucepan. It calls for 2 cups of milk, whereas yesterday it called maybe for 1. Two cups of milk in the saucepan. And sugar calls for half a cup, whereas with the vanilla pudding recipe it called for a whole cup. I think the recipe calls for a reduced amount of sugar because there is sugar in the chocolate. And the vanilla pudding recipe called for a pinch of salt. This one calls for a teaspoon. Again, I think that might have to do with the chocolate. I'm pouring it from the salt container into the 1/4 teaspoon measuring spoon. I'm doing that over the half cup measuring cup because I always pour out too much. So, milk, sugar, salt. And cook it over medium heat, stirring occasionally until the mixture begins to steam, around 3 or 4 minutes. So the vanilla pudding recipe called for using a wooden spoon specifically. This recipe doesn't specify which utensil you should use, so I am stirring with a whisk. And again, since you are heating something on a burner, I would suggest this is a point at which adults supervise you or take over altogether, just to be safe. It says to stir occasionally, so I'm not going to spend the entire 3 or 4 minutes while it heats up stirring it continuously. I'm just going to do it occasionally so I can move on to the second step, which is mixing the cornstarch and milk in this bowl. So the recipe for vanilla pudding suggested mixing together the sugar and cornstarch. This one is different and suggests mixing together milk and cornstarch. And it calls for the same amount of cornstarch, which is 3 tablespoons. So the biggest measuring spoon on my collection. 1, 2, and 3. To add to that, I'm going to mix it with a half cup milk. There's a half cup measuring line right there. And he specifically says to whisk together the milk and the cornstarch. So I will stir this just to make sure it's mixing together properly. Take the whisk out of there and move over here and whisk together the cold milk and the cornstarch. And he says to whisk it together until completely smooth. So like last time, I want to make sure that the cornstarch doesn't clump so we can have smooth pudding rather than lumpy pudding. So I think this is mixed together well. I will add it to the saucepan once the milk mixture in the saucepan has heated up, which hasn't happened yet. So I'm turning up the heat a little. Kitty is looking at me because he wants to go to the basement, so excuse me. Open the door for the kitty to go to the basement. Okay, this mixture is hot enough. It has begun to steam, so I am now going to add this to the saucepan and cook. And the goal is to cook this for another 3 to 4 minutes until the mixture thickens and just starts to boil. turn the heat up a little bit just so this doesn't take another 25 minutes. Okay, so this has thickened. It is almost coming to a boil. See, there's some bits on the whisk. These things. That, I think, is clumpy cornstarch. It's stuff that stuck to the bottom when I made that face a couple minutes ago. So I took the stir occasionally a little too casually because stuff started to stick to the bottom of the pan. So if you want to turn this into a science experiment, what you could do is take the vanilla pudding recipe, and at the end when you add the butter, also add some chocolate chips and stir it up and see if you can tell the difference between making a chocolate pudding with eggs is a different process or tastes any differently than making a chocolate pudding without eggs. The only thing that could make a difference to the cooking time is that had I used a bigger saucepan rather than smaller, because the milk cornstarch mixture would have had a greater surface area to heat up on rather than being deeper. So it would have been shallower and wider rather than deeper and narrower. So that also has an effect on how quickly things cook. Cat has emerged from the basement. Well, just in the interest of time, let's call this done. And now I add 4 ounces of chocolate, which looks like this, with whole chocolate chips, but suggested cutting them up into smaller bits, so I had done that previously, so you didn't need to see me do that. So I'm pouring in the chocolate chips and stirring. So right now the chocolate chips will melt with the residual heat because the pan is off the stove, but it still holds heat because it doesn't cool immediately. I also need to add vanilla to this mixture. 2 tablespoons of butter. And then 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And again, the residual heat will take care of melting the butter and the chocolate into the mixture. And I made that face because the vanilla went over the spoon, the teaspoon itself, the measuring spoon itself. So there's a little bit more than it calls for, but again, that's what happens when you cook at home. Now, like the vanilla pudding recipe, this says it makes up to 6 servings. Again, I don't have 6 small serving bowls for pudding, so what I'm going to do is put it into a casserole pan, like this, but pour pudding into the pan through the strainer so we can get out those lumpy bits that I had mentioned. And depending on your cookware, you may or may not be able to lift your pan by the handle when it's hot. This was designed to be an open handle, so it disperses the heat better, and thus you have a less likely chance of burning yourself holding a pan. So, that being said, use an oven mitt or pot holder. This turned out really well. Chocolate pudding in a casserole pan. It's very thick, and the right consistency, and without lumps, because I strained the lumps out. So if you're interested, look up this recipe on Mark Bittman's How to Bake Everything on hoopladigital.com with your library card and show me how it worked for you.